There exists a peculiar moment in every human being's life when you realize you don't fit in anywhere. It's not that passing sensation of being out of place at a party or family gathering, when you look around and don't recognize anyone, when conversations flow in directions you can't follow, when you smile politely but feel like you're watching a dubbed movie where the words don't match the lip movements. No, this feeling of not belonging is something much deeper and more disturbing. Something that cuts through the marrow of your days like a cold, constant blade. It's when you look around and feel as if everyone else received an instruction manual on how to live, how to relate, how to find their place in the world. But somehow you were forgotten in the distribution. Maybe you were distracted when they handed out the copies. Maybe your name wasn't on the list. Maybe you were born with an invisible disability that prevents you from decoding the signals that everyone else seems to understand instinctively. You observe people walking purposefully through the streets, their faces carrying that expression of those who know exactly where they're going and why. Talking about their jobs with a conviction you've never been able to feel regarding your own work. Building relationships that seem to make sense within some social logic that remains opaque to you. They talk about career plans as if it were natural to want to climb a corporate hierarchy. Discuss romantic relationships using terms that suggest the existence of clearly defined rules about how these things should function. Make weekend plans involving activities that are supposedly meant to be pleasurable, but that sound to you like obligations disguised as fun. And you stand there, in the middle of all this, feeling like a visitor from another planet trying to decipher the social codes of a strange civilization. An alien anthropologist who was sent to study the human species, but didn't receive adequate tools to understand their most basic rituals. Franz Kafka understood this sensation better than any other writer who ever existed. He lived his entire existence as a foreigner in his own life, like someone who was born in the wrong place, in the wrong family, at the wrong time, speaking the wrong language. Kafka was Jewish in a German Prague within the Austro-Hungarian Empire, wrote in German for an audience that spoke Czech, worked at a bureaucratic job he despised to support a family that didn't understand his art. He was a man out of time and place in every possible sense, and perhaps that's why his words echo so deeply in our hearts when he says we are like crows that claim they can fly as well as seagulls. But deep down know this is a lie. Kafka knew that when you have no place in the world, you develop a special, almost supernatural sensitivity to perceive others' loneliness, to detect the poorly disguised anxiety hiding behind social smiles, to feel the silent despair that pulses beneath polite conversations about the weather and vacation plans. You become dangerous to those who have built their identities on fragile certainties, because your mere existence questions the solidity of their world. You don't need to say anything, don't need to criticize or confront. Your simple presence, your slightly different way of moving through the world, your inability to fake enthusiasm for things that don't touch you deeply, all of this serves as an uncomfortable reminder that perhaps the entire social structure, in which they have deposited their hopes and fears, is more arbitrary and fragile than they would like to admit. The story of Marina perfectly illustrates this Kafkaesque experience of living like a ghost in your own life. At 34, she had everything society considers unmistakable signs of success. A well-located apartment in a neighborhood that decorating magazines classified as up and coming. A stable job at a digital marketing agency where her colleagues respected her and occasionally asked her opinion on important campaigns. Apparently healthy social relationships with people who invited her to birthdays and year-end dinners. She had a bank account with an emergency fund, health insurance that covered even dental treatments, a high-limit credit card she rarely used, all those objective markers of a well-structured adult life. But Marina woke up every morning with such an intense sense of unreality that she needed to touch the walls of her room, feel the rough texture of the wallpaper she had chosen and installed herself, to make sure she still existed, that she hadn't dissolved during the night like sugar in warm water. She looked at herself in the bathroom mirror and saw a familiar but distant face, as if she were observing a photograph of someone she had met long ago, but whose name she could no longer remember. She brushed her teeth, showered, chose clothes she knew were appropriate for her work environment, but all of this happened as if she were controlling a body that wasn't entirely her own, as if she were a puppet operating another puppet. Marina participated in work meetings, contributed ideas that her supervisors frequently approved and implemented, laughed at colleagues' jokes at the right moment and with the appropriate intensity, posted carefully edited photos on social media, that received likes and positive comments from people she considered friends. But inside, she felt as if she were watching someone else's life through a fogged window, as if she were a spectator of her own existence, physically present but emotionally absent, functionally competent but spiritually disconnected. The most disturbing thing was realizing that other people seemed genuinely connected to their lives, truly invested in their daily routines, authentically enthusiastic about projects that to Marina sounded like elaborate exercises in uselessness disguised as importance. Her colleagues talked about sales targets as if they were sacred missions, discussed marketing strategies as if they were planning military operations that would determine civilization's fate, celebrated small professional successes with a joy that Marina couldn't fake convincingly. She observed all this with the detachment of a documentarian filming an exotic culture, taking mental notes about the strange rituals of this urban tribe she was part of, but to which she didn't truly belong. It was as if she were playing a role in a theatrical piece whose script she had never completely read, improvising her lines based on dialogue fragments she caught from other actors, hoping no one would notice she didn't know exactly what story they were telling together. During those months, Marina tried to force herself to fit better into the life she had built for herself. She bought clothes she imagined a successful and confident person would wear, brighter colors and more modern cuts she saw in women's magazines that promised to teach how to dress for success. She adopted hobbies that seemed interesting and sophisticated to others, yoga classes that made her more anxious instead of relaxed, French cooking classes where she learned to make elaborate dishes she ate alone at home, ballroom dance classes where she pretended to enjoy being touched by strangers who smelled of strong perfume and talked about their ex-wives. Marina began attending networking events, thinking maybe the problem was just a lack of broader social connections, that perhaps she needed to expand her circle to find people who shared her true interests, whatever those interests might be. She handed out business cards printed on expensive paper, participated in conversations about industry trends she obsessively researched before each event, smiled and made eye contact and asked about people's work, with the kind of performative curiosity she had learned by watching other people in similar situations. But the more she tried to mold herself to the world around her, the more intense became the sensation of displacement, as if each attempt to fit in pushed her even further outside of herself. It was as if she were a ghost trying to pretend she had a solid body, or a song playing at a frequency no one else could hear, present but imperceptible, visible but not entirely real. Kafka deeply understood that those who find no place in the world develop a unique and disturbing way of seeing human reality. They become privileged observers of the existential condition because they are not completely immersed in the social game that blinds most people to their own contradictions. It's as if they lived perpetually with an anthropological camera in their heads, documenting the strange rituals of the human species without ever being able to participate in them with total naturalness. As Kafka wrote in his diaries with painful lucidity, "We are nihilistic thoughts that came into God's head," a phrase that perfectly captures the experience of those who live permanently outside the center of conventional existence, as if they were divine ideas that went wrong, poorly formed concepts in the imagination of a distracted deity. These people perceive the contradictions hiding behind polished social facades, the poorly disguised anxieties manifesting in apparently innocent gestures, the ancestral fears we all carry but pretend not to have when we're in public. They see through social masks because they never managed to wear one convincingly enough to forget it was a mask. They notice how elevator conversations follow rigid scripts no one questions, how people greet each other with questions that don't expect honest answers, how professional smiles are calibrated to transmit cordiality without intimacy, competence without vulnerability. Therefore, their presence can be profoundly uncomfortable for those who depend on the collective illusion that everything makes sense, that there exists a right path to follow clearly marked by visible social signage, that the rules governing life in society have a solid and rational foundation that justifies unconditional obedience to them. When you have no defined place in social territory, you naturally question why territories exist the way they exist, why certain boundaries were drawn where they were drawn, who decided these divisions were necessary or desirable. You wonder why certain professions are valued and others despised, apparently without relation to their real contribution to human well-being. Why certain relationships are considered more legitimate or morally superior to others. Why some dreams are classified as realistic and worthy of pursuit, while others are labeled as childish fantasies that must be abandoned in the name of maturity. These questions, apparently simple and even innocent, can shake the psychological foundations on which other people have built not only their public identities, but their own perceptions of value and purpose. When someone dedicates decades of life building a career in an area they secretly consider meaningless, investing in relationships that function more like mutual convenience contracts than genuine connections, pursuing objectives that were internalized from external sources without ever being questioned. The presence of a person who lives outside these structures can awaken extremely uncomfortable existential questions. The outsider doesn't need to be aggressive or critical. They can be perfectly gentle and respectful. But their way of existing, their unconscious refusal to invest totally in the social games that define most people's lives, their capacity to find meaning and satisfaction outside conventional paths, all of this functions as a mirror that reflects back the artificiality and contingency of choices that others prefer to see as natural and inevitable. It's as if the outsider's presence constantly whispered a disturbing question. What if there were other ways to live? What if you didn't have to do what you're doing? What if your priorities were different from what you were taught they should be? The danger of those who have no place in the world doesn't lie in some intrinsic malice or deliberate intention to cause psychological harm to others. On the contrary, these people are frequently kinder and more understanding than average, precisely because they know intimately the suffering of existential isolation. The danger lies in clarity, in the almost surgical capacity to see through the illusions that keep social life functioning without excessive friction. When you don't belong completely to any well-defined social, professional, or cultural category, you develop an almost anthropological perspective on human life, as if you were a field researcher studying a culture into which you were born by accident, but of which you never became a true member. You observe social rituals like an ethnographer studying an unknown tribe, taking mental notes about behaviors that others execute automatically without questioning their origins or purposes. You notice how people desperately cling to their professional identities when introducing themselves in social contexts, pronouncing job titles like magic mantras that conjure personal value, as if their worth as human beings depended entirely on the position they occupy in the corporate hierarchy for 40 hours a week. You perceive how romantic relationships often function more like elaborate mutual security contracts than genuine connections based on emotional or intellectual affinity. As partners silently negotiate responsibilities and benefits in a kind of domestic economy disguised as romance, you see how people buy things they don't need to impress other people they barely know, creating an entire economy based on dissatisfaction disguised as aspiration, on the perpetually insatiable desire to become someone slightly different from who they are through the acquisition of objects that promise transformation, but deliver only superficial and temporary changes. You observe how conversations at parties follow predictable scripts, how people ask questions whose answers they have no genuine interest in hearing, how they share information about themselves in calculated ways to manage impressions instead of creating authentic connections. This clarity can be deeply disturbing for those who have found comfort and stability within conventional structures, not because you openly judge them or aggressively criticize their choices, but because your very existence serves as a constant and silent reminder that there are other ways to live, other ways to see the world, other possibilities for organizing a human life that they might have considered once, but abandoned long ago in the name of practicality or social acceptance. Your presence functions as a walking question. What if you didn't have to live this way? What if your priorities were completely different? What if meaning and satisfaction could be found in places you never thought to look? Roberto discovered this dynamic particularly intensely at 28 when he lost his job at a financial consulting company where he had worked for 5 years. The dismissal wasn't for incompetence or misconduct. It was one of those impersonal corporate restructurings where numbers on spreadsheets determine that certain positions have become redundant to maximize operational efficiency. For 6 months of unemployment, Roberto had time to observe the world with a detachment he had never experienced before, as if he had stepped out of an aquarium and could finally see the aquarium from outside. Without the structured routine of work that previously consumed 50 hours a week of his consciousness, without the professional identity that defined him socially and that he used to introduce himself in personal contexts, Roberto began to notice things that had previously gone unnoticed or that he had automatically categorized as the way things are, without examining more closely. He observed people on public transportation during morning rush hour, all dressed similarly as if following an unwritten but universally understood dress code, all with expressions that oscillated between forced determination and masked resignation, all heading to places where they would spend most of their waking hours doing things they might not choose to do if they had other economically viable options. Roberto began to notice how social conversations followed surprisingly predictable scripts, as if everyone were playing characters based on models they had learned by observing other social actors, but that had never been questioned or adapted for their specific personalities. People asked, "How's work going?" as if it were impossible to imagine other dimensions of human experience worth discussing. They talked about career plans with a seriousness that suggested climbing corporate hierarchies was a naturally desirable goal, not one among many possibilities for organizing a life. They discussed major purchases like houses and cars as if they were personal development milestones, not practical necessities or individual preferences. Roberto began to feel like an alien anthropologist studying the rituals of a civilization whose fundamental premises he could no longer take as evident. When he finally got a new job at a similar company, he discovered he could no longer participate in professional dynamics with the same naivety as before. He saw the meetings, organizational hierarchies, urgent projects that changed priority every quarter, and monthly goals that were celebrated when achieved and quickly forgotten when replaced by new goals, as an elaborate theater where everyone pretended this was extremely important, but no one could explain exactly why it was important beyond the fact that it was what they did there. This perception made him a technically competent, but emotionally disconnected employee, someone who performed his tasks with mechanical efficiency, but without the passion or personal identification that others seemed to demonstrate, or at least fake convincingly. He became an outsider within his own professional environment, physically present but psychologically absent, meeting external expectations but unable to emotionally invest in the meaning other people attributed to work. The true discovery of those who have no place in the world is that perhaps there is no right place for anyone, that the entire social architecture we consider solid and permanent is actually a collective and contingent construction, held in the air by the force of repetition and the shared fear of questioning its foundations. Perhaps all human anxiety derives from the fact that we are all trying to fit into categories and structures that were invented by other people, who also didn't know very well what they were doing, who were improvising the rules as they advanced, responding to historical pressures and specific circumstances that no longer exist, but whose consequences still shape our present reality. Kafka deeply intuited that the fundamental human condition is displacement, not belonging, that we are all born essentially without place and spend our entire lives trying to build one for ourselves from materials borrowed from others who are also building their own places from materials borrowed from still others. It's an infinite system of circular references that never reaches a solid foundation, as if all human society were built on quicksand disguised as solid rock. In The Metamorphosis, Gregor Samsa wakes up transformed into a giant insect. But the most disturbing aspect of the story is not the physical transformation itself, it's how the family and society around him continue functioning according to their habitual logics, merely adjusting to accommodate this new bizarre reality, without questioning the fundamental premises that made such a situation possible. Gregor's metamorphosis reveals that perhaps we are all strange creatures trying to pretend we are normal. That perhaps all social normality is a collective performance based on the tacit agreement not to question its foundations, not to ask why we do what we do the way we do it. Those who cannot participate in this performance, who remain on the outside observing, end up realizing that the emperor has no clothes, that the entire structure is more fragile and arbitrary than it seems, that it could be organized in completely different ways if there were collective will to reimagine the foundations on which we build our social existence. There is a strange and melancholic beauty in this position of perpetual outsider, a kind of painful freedom that comes from not being completely captured by the illusions that govern most human lives. When you have no guaranteed place in the world, you need to create your own place, invent your own way of existing that doesn't depend totally on external validation or conformity to pre-established patterns. You develop an existential creativity that those who fit perfectly into pre-existing structures might never need to discover, a capacity for moral and aesthetic improvisation that arises from the necessity of navigating territories for which no reliable maps exist. You learn to find meaning in unexpected places, to create authentic connections based on shared vulnerability instead of superficial affinities based on similar tastes or equivalent social positions, to value truth even when it's inconvenient instead of social approval that comes from saying what others want to hear. Kafka found in writing a way to transform his displacement into art, to use his perspective as a foreigner in his own life to create literature that speaks directly to the universal experience of not belonging that we all carry, even those who seem perfectly integrated into the world. Clara always knew she was different, but it took her 31 years to understand that her difference wasn't a deficiency that needed to be corrected. Since childhood, she felt as if she were watching life through a transparent but impenetrable glass. At school, she observed other students forming groups and friendships with a naturalness that seemed almost magical to her. She could imitate appropriate social behaviors, could seem normal most of the time, but always felt she was simultaneously translating from others' language to her own internal language. Clara graduated in psychology, worked in clinics, had relationships that lasted months or years, built a life that from the outside seemed successful and balanced. But inside, she carried the constant sensation of playing a role in a play whose plot she didn't completely understand. It was reading Kafka that Clara finally found words for her experience. She realized that her sensation of displacement wasn't a sign that something was wrong with her, but evidence that she had access to a different perspective on the human condition. Clara began to value her capacity to see through social conventions, her ability to perceive hidden motivations and contradictions that others seem to ignore. She discovered that her outsider position gave her a unique understanding of human suffering, and that this made her a more effective therapist than many colleagues who had never questioned the structures within which they operated. The dangerousness of those who have no place in the world lies, therefore, in their capacity to reveal that the world as it is organized is neither inevitable nor natural. These people function as involuntary mirrors that reflect back the inconsistencies and arbitrariness we carefully keep hidden from ourselves. They don't need to criticize or directly attack social structures. Their mere existence, their different way of relating to reality, their unconscious refusal to participate completely in the collective game already represents a form of questioning. Therefore, they are frequently perceived as threatening by those who have invested deeply in the illusion that their life choices are the only possible or correct ones. Kafka knew this and expressed this perception through characters who are persecuted by authorities whose motives remain obscure, but whose power is unquestionable. The crime of these characters is not something they did, but something they are. People who don't fit naturally into available categories, who ask inconvenient questions simply by existing the way they exist. It's important to understand that the danger is not real in the sense that these people represent some concrete threat to others' security or well-being. The danger is psychological and existential. When you encounter someone who lives authentically outside conventional structures and who, despite this or perhaps because of it, demonstrates wisdom and inner peace that you don't possess, this can awaken uncomfortable questions about your own choices. It can make you wonder if you're living the life you really want to live or just the life you were taught to want. It can make you question whether your goals are genuinely yours or were internalized from external sources. It can make you recognize that perhaps you too have no guaranteed place in the world and that your entire sense of belonging is more fragile than you would like to admit. These are questions many people prefer not to ask because the answers might require changes that seem scary or impossible. Pause here for a moment. Have you ever felt like you were living someone else's life? Like you were following a script you didn't write? That sensation of always being slightly out of sync with the world around you, as if everyone knew something you missed? I know you have, because you wouldn't be here if you didn't recognize this experience on some level. If you've ever felt like a foreigner in your own life, write in the comments just, "Me too." You don't need to explain anything more. Just those two words. Because when you do that, you're creating a connection point with other people who carry the same sensation of displacement. And maybe you'll realize that being nowhere can be paradoxically the most honest place of all. But there is profound wisdom that emerges from this experience of not belonging. Kafka discovered that when you have no place in the world, You are forced to create your own richer and more complex internal world. You develop internal resources that those who rely entirely on external structures might never need to discover. You learn to find beauty and meaning in unexpected places. You develop a capacity for compassion based on intimate understanding of the existential suffering we all carry. You become less dependent on external approval and more capable of validating yourself. You discover that solitude can be creative, that isolation can be revealing, that being on the margin can offer a unique and valuable perspective on the center. Kafka transformed his outsider experience into one of the most powerful and lasting literatures in human history. He took his sensation of not belonging and transformed it into art that speaks directly to the universal experience of alienation that we all know, even those who would never admit it publicly. The journey of those who have no place in the world is the journey of discovering that perhaps the right place is not something you find, but something you create. It's the perception that authenticity is more valuable than acceptance, that personal integrity is worth more than superficial social integration. It's understanding that your unique perspective, your different way of seeing reality, your capacity to question what others take for granted, are not flaws that need correction, but gifts that can contribute to a deeper understanding of the human condition. Kafka taught us that metamorphosis is possible, that we can transform ourselves not to fit better into the world as it is, but to create new possibilities of existence that honor our inner truth. He showed us that it's possible to live with dignity and purpose even when, or perhaps especially when, you cannot find your place in conventional structures. The true danger of those who have no place in the world is that they reveal that freedom is possible. They demonstrate that you can live without following all social scripts, that you can find meaning without accepting prefabricated definitions of success, that you can be happy without possessing everything society says you should want. This is a dangerous message for a system that depends on conformity and consumption to keep functioning. Therefore, these people are frequently marginalized, pathologized, or simply ignored. But their existence continues serving as a reminder that other ways of living are possible, that the world as it is organized is not the only available option, that you can choose to create your own definition of a well-lived life. If you've made it this far, it's because you recognize something of yourself in this description. You know what it's like to feel displaced, to question structures others take for granted, to seek authenticity in a world that frequently rewards performance. You're not alone in this search. This channel exists for those who, like Kafka, understand that life's most important questions rarely have simple answers, but that it's worth exploring them with courage and honesty. Every week we create a space where you can pause, breathe, and recognize that your unique perspective has value, that your different way of seeing the world is a gift, not a flaw. Subscribe not just to receive notifications, but to become part of a community that celebrates the complexity of human experience and understands that sometimes having no place in the world is exactly the right place to be. Because your journey of self-discovery, your courage to live authentically even when that means living on the margins, your willingness to ask difficult questions about the meaning of existence, all of this has immense value that goes far beyond social approval or conventional success. You deserve to honor your truth, even if it's different from everything you've heard before.